A thick fog clung to the Parisian streets like a shroud, swallowing the gaslights and muffling the sound of distant footsteps. Chief Inspector Jules Maigret stood at the threshold of number 14 Rue des Ormes, staring at the grim facade of the apartment building. The call had come an hour ago, a death, perhaps a murder, but nothing about it made sense. The landlady had described it as unnatural, and that word sat uneasily with him. He stepped inside, the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic filling his nostrils. A uniformed officer led him up the stairs, past tightly shut doors, where behind them the unseen tenants must have been pressing their ears to the walls, whispering among themselves. He had seen this before. People loved a mystery so long as they were not part of it. The body lay in a modest but orderly room on the second floor. A single gas lamp flickered on the nightstand, casting long, quivering shadows over the walls. The man was slumped in an armchair, head tilted unnaturally to one side, mouth slightly open as if caught in the middle of a thought. He was dressed in a crisp grey suit, shoes polished to a high shine, and a pocket watch glinted in his vest. Maigret took in the details: the glass of wine on the table, untouched, the half-smoked cigarette in the ashtray, the absence of any signs of struggle. Cause
of death?
He asked the doctor, kneeling beside the body. No obvious wounds, the man replied, adjusting his spectacles. No bruising, no signs of poison. If I had to guess, I'd say heart failure, but he was a young man. Maigret's gaze fell upon the one thing in the room that didn't belong. On the carpet, near the victim's polished shoes, was a single chess piece, a black knight. He bent down, picking it up between two fingers, feeling its smooth, cool surface. "What do you make
of this?"
he asked. The doctor shook his head. "I have no idea. There's no chessboard in the room." Maigret straightened up, slipping the piece into his pocket. "Who found him?" "The landlady," the officer beside him answered. "Madame Fournier. She said she heard whispers." "Whispers?" Maigret frowned. "Yes. She was passing by the room and heard murmuring inside. But when she knocked, there was no answer. When she opened the door with her spare key, she found him like this. Dead, but with no one else in the room. A locked room."
Mystery, then. Maigret took a slow breath, the weight of the situation settling over him.
"Who was he?" "Name's Etienne Lemoine," the officer continued. "A businessman. Travelled frequently, but rented this place under a different name, Pierre Duroc. That, too, was a piece of the puzzle. A man with two identities, dying quietly in a locked room, leaving behind a chess piece and the memory of whispers." Maigret glanced around, his mind assembling the possibilities. Had someone entered and left unseen? Or had the whispers been something else, a sign of the victim?
Speaking to himself before his death?
He turned toward the doorway, where Madame Fournier hovered anxiously, twisting her hands in her apron. "Tell me exactly what you heard," Maigret said, his voice gentle but firm. The old woman hesitated, then whispered, "It was like someone was in there with him, speaking very low just before I knocked. But when I opened the door, there was no one. Just silence." The detective studied her carefully, noting the genuine fear in her eyes. She believed what she had heard. That made it all the more troubling. Maigret cast another glance around the room. A mystery that was either too simple or impossibly complex had begun to unfold, and as always, he would find its answer. But for now, the whispers lingered in the
air unanswered.
Maigret lingered in the doorway, his sharp eyes tracing the contours of the room. The quiet was almost oppressive, thick with the weight of unanswered questions. He had seen many crime scenes before, but this one had a peculiar stillness, as though the very air resisted giving up its secrets. He turned his attention back to Etienne Lemoine, Pierre Duroc, as he had chosen to be known in this rented space, a man who lived with one name and died under another. That, in itself, was telling. A secret life or simply a habit of deception? Either way, a man with two names often had two faces. The Black Knight rested in Maigray's pocket, its cool weight pressing against the fabric of his coat, a single chess piece deliberately placed or carelessly dropped. Either way, it didn't belong here. He glanced at the floor again, scanning for any signs of a matching set. But there was none. Just the faint indentation in the carpet where the piece had landed, as though it had fallen from a hand that would never move another. Ibitsorm, officer beside him, cleared his throat. "We're checking his personal effects now, sir. A wallet with 200 francs, a silver cigarette case, a train ticket from Lille, dated 3 days ago. No letters, no notes." "No passport?" Maigret asked. The officer shook his head. "Nothing official, just the papers under the name Duroc, a man travelling under a false name, carrying only the essentials, no personal letters, no clutter." That suggested a deliberate effort to stay untraceable, or at the very least, unattached. Yet he had chosen to stay in a boarding house, a place where people took notice of comings and goings. That was a contradiction. Maigret turned to Madame Fournier, who stood nervously by the door, clutching her apron. "Tell me, madame, did he have visitors?" The landlady hesitated. "Not often, no. He was a quiet man, polite, always paid on time. But now that you mention it," her brow furrowed, as if she were searching her memory for something that had seemed unimportant until now. "There was someone last night. I didn't see them, but I heard the footsteps. Someone came up the stairs late, just past midnight." "Did they leave?" Maigret asked. I'm not sure," she admitted. "I assumed they did, but I didn't hear them go." That was enough to set his mind turning. Someone had come, and perhaps they had never left. His gaze flickered to the window. It was closed, latched from the inside. No fire escape, no ledge. Wide enough for a careful retreat. The door had been locked when the landlady opened it. So if someone had been inside when Lemoine died, how had they vanished without a trace? He moved back toward the armchair, this time crouching to examine the floor more closely. The carpet was thick, but near the edge of the room, just beneath the side table, there was something subtle, a scuff mark, faint but distinct, as if a shoe had pivoted abruptly. Someone had stood there, perhaps hidden by the shadows, watching. As the man in the chair took his final breath, Maigret straightened, his gaze shifting to the glass of wine on the table. Untouched. That was odd. A man alone in his room, freshly poured wine, yet he had not sipped it. Either he had been interrupted, or he had never intended to drink it. He picked it up, swirling the liquid gently. The aroma was strong, rich, but beneath the expected scent there was something else. Faint, bitter. "Get this to the lab," he ordered, handing the glass to the officer. "Tell them to check for any trace of poison." The doctor, still hovering over the body, adjusted his spectacles. "You suspect poisoning, Inspector?" "I suspect a great many things," Maigret murmured. He turned back to the landlady. "Madame Fournier, you mentioned whispers. Were you certain it was a voice?" The old woman hesitated, twisting her fingers together. "Yes. But now I don't know. It was so soft, so strange, like someone speaking from very far away, or... She stopped herself as if afraid to sound foolish. Or what? Maigret pressed gently. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Like an echo. An echo. That was interesting. Maigret's gaze moved again to the corners of the room, the walls. The building was old, its structure imperfect. It was possible sound had carried from another room. But that would mean someone nearby had been speaking at the moment of Lemoyne's death. He turned to the officer. "Who occupies the rooms beside this one?" "The one to the right is empty," the officer replied. "A tenant left last week. The one to the left belongs to a Monsieur Vanier." "Bring him in," Maigret said. A few minutes later, the door opened, and a thin, nervous-looking man stepped in. He was in his 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a coat slightly too large for his frame. His fingers twitched at his sides. "You're Monsieur Vanier?" Maigret asked. "Yes, Inspector. Is something wrong?" "That depends," Maigret said mildly. "Did you hear anything last night?" Vanier hesitated. "No, nothing unusual, just the usual creaks of the building."
"I went to bed early. You heard no voices?" The man blinked rapidly behind his glasses. "Voices?" "No." Maigret studied him for a moment, noting the way his gaze flickered toward the body, then away. He was lying, not necessarily about
everything, but about something. He reached into his pocket, retrieving the Black Knight, holding it up between his fingers. "Have you ever seen this before?" Vanier's reaction was small but telling. A barely perceptible tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in posture. "No," he said too quickly. Maigret nodded, slipping the chess piece back into his pocket. "That will be all for now, Monsieur Vanier, but don't leave the building." The man swallowed hard. Of course, as soon as the door closed behind him, Maigret turned to the officer. Search his room. The mystery was beginning to take shape, the edges sharpening. Someone had been here last night. Someone had spoken, perhaps to Lemoine, perhaps to themselves, and someone had left behind a chess piece as a silent message or a careless mistake. The puzzle was incomplete, but Maigret had the first threads in his grasp. Now it was only a matter of pulling until the whole thing unraveled. Maigret stood in the dimly lit corridor, the murmur of whispers beyond closed doors now stilled by his presence. The residents of the boarding house were watching, waiting. He could feel it in the weight of the silence pressing in around him. The walls of this place had heard things, conversations held in hushed tones, footsteps in the night, the last breaths of a man who had died too quietly. And now they would
have to speak.
Laurent let the silence stretch between them, the weight of it pressing down on the room. He knew better than to force the first admission. Guilt had a way of revealing itself under pressure. Pierre's fingers twitched. Madame Marchand's breathing had become shallow, her lips pressed tightly together. They were both holding something back, but was it the same truth? Laurent shifted his stance. "The old press house," he said. "That's where your employer was supposed to
be at midnight. Did you know that?" Pierre's head jerked up, his lips parting slightly before he caught himself.
"No." Too quick, too sharp. Laurent nodded, filing the reaction away. "Then let's take a step back. Marchand owed money, that much we know. Vasseur wanted his payment, but Marchand refused to part with the rare bottle. He had another plan, one that required a secret meeting in the dead of night. And now he's dead." Laurent's voice remained steady, but his words cut like a blade. Someone knew what he was planning, and that someone met him before he could go through with it. Pierre swallowed hard. It wasn't me. Then who? Laurent asked. Pierre's mouth opened and closed. His eyes flickered again toward Madame Marchand, whose fingers had curled tightly around the fabric of her dress. A quiet tension hung in the air, fragile and electric. Laurent turned his gaze to her. Madame, you said your husband didn't tell you where he was going.
But did you suspect? She exhaled slowly. I thought he might be meeting someone dangerous. He was desperate, Inspector. He would have done anything to keep our home. Even... She stopped herself, shaking her head. Even what?
Laurent pressed. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. Even sell information. Laurent's mind sharpened. Information? About what? Madame Marchand hesitated, then spoke so softly he almost missed it. The smuggling routes. The words settled heavily between them. Laurent took a slow breath, his thoughts racing. The wine trade in the region was a facade for deeper dealings. Luxury contraband moved through these cellars, a secret well kept by those who profited from it. If Marchand had threatened to expose someone's operation in exchange for money, he had made himself a target. Laurent turned back to Pierre. You knew, didn't you? Pierre's face was ghostly pale. A sharp knock at the door interrupted him. Inspector Renaud stepped inside, his coat damp from the mist outside. Laurent, we found something. His tone was urgent. Laurent glanced at Madame Marchand and Pierre before turning to Renaud. Where? The old press house. Renaud's jaw was tight. Blood, a lot of it, and something else. He hesitated, then held up a small, delicate object wrapped in cloth. Laurent took it, carefully unfolding the material. A hairpin. Laurent glanced up at Madame Marchand. Her hand instinctively reached for her hair, where an identical pin held up the loose strands at her temple. Silence. Laurent exhaled. The web of deception was beginning to unravel. Laurent turned the hairpin between his fingers, its delicate frame glinting under the dim light. A fine smear of blood stained the tip. He looked up at Madame Marchand, whose hand had instinctively risen to touch her hair, only to stop midway. Her face was a careful mask, but Laurent had already caught the flicker of realization in her eyes. Before he could speak, Inspector Renaud cleared his throat. We also found a trail leading away from the press house toward the river, drag marks. His tone was grim. Looks like someone tried to dispose of the body before giving up. Laurent took a slow breath. The pieces were falling into place, but too neatly, too quickly. Madame Marchand's hairpin, the press house as the crime scene, the half-abandoned attempt to move the body. Before Maigret could press further, the door opened again. Another officer, this one looking grim, stepped inside. Inspector, we've just finished searching the victim's room more thoroughly. We found this inside the lining of his coat. He's handed over a small slip of paper, its edges frayed from where it had been hastily torn. Maigret unfolded it, his sharp eyes scanning the faint scrawl of ink. Meet me at midnight. Don't be late. No name, no indication of who had written it. Just a command, urgent and precise. He turned back to Vanier. Does this mean anything to...
You? Vanier shook his head, but there was something about the way he did it. Too quickly, too forcefully. You didn't hear the door open last night?
Maigret pressed. No, I told you I heard only voices. He was lying again. Maigret could sense it. But why? To protect himself or someone else? Just then, Madame Fournier peeked into the room, her face pale. Inspector, there's someone else you should speak to. Maigret gestured for her to enter. Who? She twisted her apron in her hands. A woman. She came earlier this morning, asking for Monsieur Duroc. I told her what had happened, and she turned white as a sheet. She left in a hurry, but not. Before she asked, she hesitated. Maigray's eyes narrowed. Asked what? Madame Fournier swallowed. If we had found a letter. Maigret felt a slow ripple of understanding settle over him. A woman, you say? Yes, the landlady said, voice barely above a whisper. She wouldn't give her name, but she was young, elegant, and frightened. A woman looking for a letter. A secret meeting at midnight. A man with two identities and a chess piece out of place. The threads of deception were tightening. And Maigret was ready to pull. Maigret stood by the window watching the street below as the rain drizzled.
Over the quiet boarding house.
Somewhere out there, a woman was running, from the truth, from her own fears, or perhaps from him. A woman elegant and frightened, searching for a letter. The landlady's words still lingered in his mind. If this woman had been expecting something, a message, an answer, then what had Pierre Lemoine intended to tell her before he died? And more importantly, had someone else made sure he never had the chance? He turned back to Vanier, who still sat in the armchair, his hands gripping his knees as though bracing himself for another blow. Maigret studied him carefully, weighing the balance of fear and guilt in the man's expression. Tell me, monsieur. Vanier, he said, voice steady, did Pierre Lemoine have enemies? Vanier hesitated, his mouth opening slightly, before he pressed his lips into a thin line. A long pause, then. I wouldn't say enemies, but he wasn't well-liked. Maigret arched a brow. By whom? Another pause. The other tenants.
Myself included. The confession came reluctantly, but it wasn't surprising.
A man like Lemoine, living under a false name, keeping no ties, wasn't the type to inspire warm feelings. Why? Maigret pressed. Vanier exhaled, rubbing his temples. Because he wasn't who he pretended to be. Maigret leaned in slightly. Go on. Vanier hesitated, then sighed. He acted like an ordinary man, but he slipped sometimes. The way he spoke, the things he knew. It wasn't the life of a simple travelling clerk. He had money, but he was careful with it. And there
were visitors.
Maigret's attention sharpened. What kind of visitors? Men, mostly. Not from around here. They would come late, stay briefly, and leave. And once I saw him arguing with someone in the hallway. A woman. A woman. The same one who had been here this morning? What did she look like? Dark hair, well-dressed, but she wasn't from here. I'd bet anything on that. Maigret nodded, considering. A woman. A letter. Secret meetings. Lemoine's life was beginning to take on new dimensions. Just then, the officer who had searched Vanier's room returned, carrying a small notebook. Inspector, he said, lowering his voice, we found this in Monsieur Vanier's wardrobe. Maigret took the notebook and flipped it open. The pages were filled with careful, precise handwriting, records of movements, dates, observations, a log of Lemoine's activities. His gaze lifted to Vanier, who had gone pale. You were watching him? Maigret said. Vanier swallowed hard. I was curious. Suspicious. I told you he wasn't who he claimed to be. I wanted to know what he was hiding. And what did you find? Vanier hesitated. He received letters, always from the same sender, no return address. He read them and burned them immediately. Maigret tapped the notebook. And did you ever see what was there?
In them? Vanier shook his head.
No, but whatever it was, it troubled him. Maigret closed the notebook, his thoughts turning. Lemoine had been a man with secrets, secrets worth protecting. But had they been worth killing for? He turned to the officer. "Where are his belongings now?" "In his room, sir. We're cataloguing them." "I want another look," Maigret said. He stepped back into Lemoine's quarters, the air still heavy with the scent of old smoke and the remnants of last night's death. The room was sparse, but not untouched. He went to the desk, flipping through the papers left behind, hotel receipts, a train schedule, nothing incriminating. But then, tucked beneath a stack of newspapers, he found something else. A torn envelope, the ink smudged by hurried fingers. The contents were missing, but the handwriting on the front was clear and deliberate. It matched the note found in his coat. "Meet me at midnight. Don't be late." Maigret turned the envelope over. There, in small letters, was a set of initials. CGA woman, a letter, and now initials. The puzzle was filling in. He stepped out into the corridor where Madame Fournier was waiting anxiously. "Madame, this woman who came asking for the letter, did she leave on foot?" "Yes, Inspector. She walked toward the boulevard." "She seemed distressed." He nodded. "Did she leave a name?" "No, but Maigret had a name now. C.G." He turned back to the officer. "Find out if any of the local hotels have a guest with those initials. If this woman was looking for a letter, she'll still be nearby." As the officer left, Maigret turned back to Vanier, who had been watching silently. "Do you know anyone with those initials?" Vanier hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he said, "Clémence Giraud." Maigret's brow lifted. "Who is she?" "A woman Lemoine used to meet. Not often, but regularly." "Where?" "At the Café Lemoine, near the station." A café, a woman, and a man with too many secrets. The threads were tightening, and Maigret was ready to pull. The Café Lemoine was a modest place tucked near the station, a narrow establishment where the scent of strong coffee mingled with the damp chill of the evening. Maigret entered, without hesitation, shaking the drizzle from his coat as he scanned the room. A few patrons sat at their tables, hunched over newspapers or murmuring over half-empty glasses of pastis. In the corner, a woman sat alone. She was younger than he had expected, no more than 30, with dark hair pinned neatly beneath a small hat. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on the street outside. Clémence Giraud. Maigret approached, his presence casting a shadow over her table. She started slightly when she looked up, her fingers tightening around the handle of her cup. She knew who he was before he even spoke. "Inspector Maigret," he said, lowering himself into the seat across from her. "You were looking for a letter." Her breath caught, just barely, before she composed herself. "I don't know what you mean," Maigret studied her, taking his time. "You came to the boarding house this morning asking if we had found something, a letter, perhaps one that Pierre Lemoine was supposed to give you." Clémence's lips parted, but she hesitated. Then, with a resigned sigh, she set down her spoon. "I was afraid of this," she murmured. "Afraid of what?" She looked up at him, her dark eyes weary. "That something had happened to him. That's why I went there. And now you're here, which means I was right." Maigret watched her closely. "How did you know something was wrong?" Her hands fidgeted in her lap. "Because he missed our meeting. Pierre was never late. He was—" "Careful."
"Careful about what?" She hesitated again, then exhaled slowly. "We were supposed to leave Paris. He promised me we'd go far away." "Why?" She looked down, tracing the rim of her cup with a delicate finger. "Because Pierre wasn't who he said he was."
Maigret felt no surprise. He had known that much already. But now he wanted her version. Then who was he? Clémence swallowed hard. A thief! There it was, the missing piece, or at least part of it. He never told me everything, she admitted. But I knew he was involved in something dangerous. He had money more than he should have. He said it was nearly over, that we could start fresh, but her voice trailed off. But someone didn't want him to leave, Maigret finished for her. She nodded, her eyes glistening. I thought maybe he had changed his mind, but when I heard he was dead. Her voice broke slightly, but she steadied
herself. That's why I went to find the letter. It was supposed to be instructions. A final message before we left. Maigret considered her words. The note found in Lemoine's coat had been brief, but it wasn't necessarily meant for her. If she hadn't received her letter, then who had? He leaned back slightly. Tell me.
Mademoiselle Giraud, who did Pierre steal from? Her face paled. I don't know. It was a lie. Before he could press her, the cafe door swung open sharply, and an officer stepped inside, looking around before spotting Maigret. He hurried over, slightly out of breath. Inspector, he said, lowering his voice. We've got him. Maigret frowned. Got who? Vanier. He tried to leave the boarding house an hour ago with a packed bag. When we searched him, we found this. The officer reached into his pocket and produced a small, crumpled envelope. Maigret took it, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting on the front. The missing letter. For the first time, Clémence looked genuinely afraid. No, she whispered, that's not possible. Maigret turned back to her. Tell me what's in it. She shook her head. I don't know. But he could see it in her expression. She was desperate to find out. He broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. The handwriting was hurried, uneven. Clémence, I have the money. Meet me at the station at midnight. If something happens to me, Vanier knows the rest. Trust no one. A slow realization settled over Maigret. The authorities had their man, a suspect caught trying to flee with a crucial piece of evidence. By all accounts, the case was solved, and yet something didn't fit. Vanier had been watching Lemoine, but that didn't mean he had killed him. And if he had taken the letter, why? To keep it hidden? Or because he, too, had been looking for answers? Clémence sat frozen, her eyes darting over the words as though willing them to change. This doesn't make sense, she murmured. He wasn't supposed to, he wasn't. She looked up sharply. Vanier didn't kill him. Maigret remained silent. She leaned forward. Pierre was afraid of someone else. He didn't trust Vanier, but if he thought he was in danger, why would he leave him a message? It was the right question. Outside, the sound of a police whistle cut through the night. The city moved on, unaware that a killer was still at large. Maigret sat in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows against the walls. Outside, the city breathed in restless murmurs, the Seine flowing steadily beneath the bridges, indifferent to the crimes and secrets its waters had witnessed. The letter from Pierre Lemoine lay open in front of him, the ink smudged slightly where hurried fingers had folded it. The words carried urgency, desperation, but also something else. A calculated final move. If Lemoine had truly feared for
his life, why had he left his fate in the hands of a man he barely tolerated? And why had Vanier tried to run? A cigarette smouldered between Maigret's fingers as he exhaled slowly, his mind tracing the paths he had taken so far.
Every thread led back to the same tangled history, Lemoine, Clémence, Vanier. But something had been missing. And then the memory came back to him, something minor, an old case from years ago, buried in the archives but never quite forgotten. He reached for his telephone, dialing swiftly. "Lucas," he said when the sergeant answered. "Find me the file on the Lapointe robbery." 10 years ago, the case was never solved. A pause, then a murmur of understanding. That was a bank job, wasn't it? The gang vanished with a fortune. No one was ever caught. Exactly, Maigret said. And I think Pierre Lemoine wasn't just any thief. He was one of them. The file arrived within the hour, thick with faded reports, witness statements, and old, grainy photographs. As Maigret flipped through the pages, the pieces fell into place. The robbery had been meticulously planned. A team of 3 men had executed it, striking just before closing time. The police had tracked them to a safe house, but by the time they arrived, the place was empty, save for a pool of blood on the floor. One of the thieves had turned on the others. The money had vanished, and so had the criminals. One name stood out from an old witness statement, a former banker who had been forced to open the vault at gunpoint. He had described one of the thieves in peculiar detail. Soft-spoken, deliberate, with an air of someone who didn't quite belong among hardened criminals, a man who had seemed reluctant. Maigret's fingers tightened around the page. Moreau stiffened. "The journalist?" Laurent nodded, already moving toward the door. Mireille Dubois had been a thorn in his side since the investigation began, always a step too close, always asking the right questions. She had sources he couldn't, trace information she shouldn't have. He had dismissed her as an ambitious reporter, hungry for the next big headline. But what if she had been more than that? What if she had been inside this from the beginning? The drive to her apartment was short, the rain streaking against the windshield as Laurent's mind raced. He had been looking at this case from the wrong angle. Every move had seemed disconnected. Pierre's paranoia, the missing evidence, the calculated timing of the attacks, but now a thread was pulling everything together. As they pulled up to the building, Laurent took in the darkened windows. No lights, no movement. Moreau frowned. She wouldn't be here if she's involved. She might not have had a choice, Laurent said. They took the stairs 2 at a time. Laurent knocked sharply. No response. "Dubois, open the door." Silence. Moreau exchanged a look with him before reaching for the knob. Locked, Laurent took a step back and slammed his shoulder against the wood. The door gave way, swinging inward to reveal an apartment in disarray. Papers were strewn across the floor, the scent of overturned coffee lingering in the air. A laptop sat open on the table, screen cracked. But it was the chair in the center of the room that stopped Laurent cold. The rope dangled loosely, as if hastily cut. Whoever had been restrained here was gone. "Mireille," Moreau muttered. Laurent's jaw clenched. Someone had taken her. Maybe to silence her, maybe for leverage. His gaze swept the room. The mess wasn't random. Whoever had been here had been looking for something. But what? Then his eyes landed on the desk. Among the scattered notes and open folders, something stood out, a photograph. He picked it up, his pulse hammering. It was an old image, slightly faded at the edges. A group of people. Familiar faces. Pierre was there. But so was Mireille. And standing behind them, smiling in a way that sent a chill down Laurent's spine, was the one person they had never considered.
A suspect! The pattern had been in front of them all along. Laurent tightened his grip on the photograph, his mind racing.
The faded image told a story he had failed to see before, a connection hidden beneath layers of deception. Pierre. Mireille. And the man standing just behind them, the one who had orchestrated everything from the shadows. Moreau leaned in, his eyes narrowing. That's— Yes, Laurent said, his voice grim. And it means we've been looking in the wrong direction this entire time. The man in the photograph was François Delacroix, a name that carried weight in the Parisian elite, wealthy, respected, untouchable, a patron of the arts, a benefactor of charities. And yet here he was, woven into the past of two people who had become central to the case. Moreau exhaled sharply. If Delacroix is involved, this isn't just a murder case. It's something much bigger. Laurent nodded, already piecing together the implications. Delacroix had funded countless ventures, many of them seemingly philanthropic. But behind that carefully crafted facade, rumors had always swirled, whispers of influence peddling, of debts that could never be repaid. And now, it seemed, of something even darker. He turned back to the mess of papers on Mireille's desk, scanning them with renewed urgency. If she had been taken, it was because she had uncovered something dangerous, something Delacroix couldn't afford to let her expose.
Vanier tried to run. A cigarette smouldered between Maigret's fingers as he exhaled slowly, his mind tracing.
The weight of that realization settled heavily in the room. Vanier shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier defiance waning under Maigret's steady gaze. There was more he wasn't saying, but pressing him further now would yield nothing. Vanier was a man who revealed things in increments, only when he saw no other choice. Maigret stood, gathering the file and the letter. "You're not going anywhere?" he said. "Not yet." Vanier let out a breath, somewhere between relief and frustration. He wasn't innocent, but he wasn't the killer either. That left only one real question: where was Claude Garand? The problem was, if Garand had been believed dead for a decade, there would be no recent trace of him. He would be a ghost. No records, no addresses, no movement anyone had noticed, and yet he had found Pierre Lemoine, which meant he wasn't as invisible as he thought. Back at his office, Maigret lit another cigarette, his thoughts circling the same stubborn question. How do you track a man who doesn't exist? He reached for the case file again, flipping through the old crime scene photos. The abandoned safe house, the pool of blood, the scattered bills left behind in the chaos. The reports were careful, clinical. They described Garand as the most violent of the three, the one least likely to leave unfinished business. But there was no body found that night, no official confirmation of death, only the assumption that whoever had bled that much couldn't
have survived. An assumption. Maigret exhaled, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling.
If Garand had lived, he would have needed help. Medical attention, and in the criminal world, men like him didn't go to hospitals. They went to people who owed them favors. An idea formed, sharp and sudden. He stubbed out his cigarette and reached for the phone, dialing quickly. "Lucas," he said, when the sergeant answered. "I need a list of doctors, not the ones in hospitals, the ones who work in the shadows, the kind who patch up bullet wounds with no questions asked." There was a pause, then a low whistle. "That's a short list, Chief, but I know where to start." Within the hour, Maigret was standing outside a modest, aging building on the Rue des Récollets. A brass plaque by the door read, "Dr. Émile Duret, General Practitioner." But Maigret knew better. Duret was a man who had built his practice on discretion, tending to criminals and wounded men who couldn't afford the police asking too many questions. If Garand had survived, Duret would know. He knocked, and after a moment the door cracked open. A thin man in his 60s peered out, his gaze wary, until he recognized the silhouette before him. His expression soured. "Maigret," he muttered. "I knew I should have closed early tonight." Maigret smiled faintly. I just need a moment of your time, Emile. Duret sighed but stepped aside, letting him in. The office smelled of antiseptic and old wood, the walls lined with books and neatly labelled bottles. I'm looking for someone, Maigret said, wasting no time. An old name, but one I think you might remember. Claude Garand. Duret's reaction was almost imperceptible, a slight twitch of his fingers, a too casual glance toward the cabinet behind him. Then, just as quickly, his expression smoothed. Never heard of him. Maigret nodded slowly, as if considering the answer. He stepped past Duret, strolling toward the cabinet. He ran a hand along the wood, then casually reached for the handle. Duret stiffened. You need a warrant for that. I don't need to open it, Maigret said lightly.
I just needed to see your reaction. Duret exhaled sharply. Damn you, Maigret! The detective turned, watching him carefully. He came to you, didn't he? The night of the robbery. Duret rubbed a hand over his face. He was half dead,
he admitted grudgingly. Whoever shot him meant for him to die slow, but he didn't. Maigret felt a chill of certainty. And after? Duret hesitated, then shrugged. He disappeared. Never saw him again. Not once? Duret shook his head, but Maigret wasn't done. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Then why did you look at that cabinet when I said his name? The doctor's face went pale. Emile, Maigret continued, if you're hiding something, now is the time to speak. Duret hesitated, then, with a reluctant sigh, stepped forward and unlocked the cabinet. He reached inside and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. I found this in my letterbox 3 nights ago, he said. No return address. Maigret took it, unfolding the page. The message was brief, written in a careful, deliberate hand. Duret. He's in Paris. Watching. Not finished. No signature. Maigret's pulse quickened. Someone had tried to warn Duret, someone who knew Garand was still alive. He folded the note carefully, his mind racing. If Garand was in Paris, it meant he hadn't killed Lemoyne and vanished. No, he was still here, still watching, still waiting for something. But for what? Maigret met Duret's gaze. Who sent this? The doctor shook his head. I don't know. But Maigret could see the doubt in his eyes. He suspected something. Maybe he was afraid to admit it. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Duret flinched. Maigret turned, his instincts suddenly on edge. The knock came again, more insistent this time. A shadow moved beyond the frosted glass. Outside, someone was waiting, and for the first time in the case, Maigret felt something. He rarely did, a premonition, a sense that, at long last, the hunter was about to reveal himself. Maigret's fingers hovered near his coat pocket, where his revolver rested, though he didn't draw it. He took a step toward the door, nodding for Duret to stay back. The old doctor, visibly shaken, obeyed. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps, deliberate but impatient. Maigret turned the knob and pulled the door open just enough to see who was on the other side. A wiry man in a damp trench coat stood in the rain, his face half obscured by the upturned collar. His sharp, bird-like eyes flicked between Maigret and the dimly lit office behind him. I need to speak with Duret. Maigret didn't move. About what? The man hesitated, then exhaled through his nose. About Claude Garand. That was enough. Maigret opened the door wider, stepping aside. The man slipped in quickly, shaking off the rain as if it clung to him like an unwelcome memory. He didn't acknowledge Duret right away. instead turning to face Maigret fully. "I know who sent the note," he said, "and I know what Garand wants." Duret made a strangled noise behind them, but Maigret kept his focus on the visitor. "Who are you?" "Antoine Lemercier," the man replied. "I used to work for Garand." Maigret's instincts tightened. "Used to." A phrase that could mean anything. "Go on." Lemercier cast a wary glance at Duret, then at the closed window. "We can't stay here long. If Garand knows I came, I won't leave this room alive." Maigret lit a cigarette, waiting. Lemercier swallowed. "He never left Paris," he said finally. "He's been here all along, keeping to the shadows, waiting for the right moment. When he found out Lemoine was still alive, he saw it as unfinished business." "And Vanier?" Maigret asked. "Why not kill him too?" Lemercier gave a humorless smile. "Vanier never pulled the trigger that night. He ran when things went wrong. But Lemoine? He's the reason Garand got shot. The reason."
He lost everything.
Maigret exhaled smoke, watching Lemercier's expression carefully. He wasn't lying, at least not about the key details. But something felt off, something he couldn't yet put into words. "And the note?" Maigret pressed. "Who sent it?" Lemercier hesitated. "I did," Duret inhaled sharply, his eyes darting to Maigret's. "I thought it might push you in the right direction," Lemercier continued. "I was hoping you'd find him before he found me." Maigret let the silence settle for a moment. Then quietly he asked, "What does he want now?" Lemercier's expression darkened. "Not just revenge, he wants something from Lemoine's past. Something that went missing the night of the heist." "What?" Lemercier hesitated, then his lips parted. To speak, to confess, Maigret wasn't sure. But before the words could leave his mouth, something cracked the night air outside, a sharp, percussive sound that sent Duret stumbling back, his face going pale.
A gunshot! Maigret reacted instantly, moving to the door.
But Lemercier was faster. He was already retreating, his hands up, panic flooding his face. "I didn't—" A second shot rang out. The light in the office flickered, then dimmed, as if the night had swallowed it whole. Maigret threw open the door, scanning the street. Shadows stretched in every direction, the rain shimmering under the gas lamps. A dark figure moved swiftly in the distance, disappearing around a corner. He turned back, and his gut clenched. Lemercier was slumped against the wall, a dark stain spreading across his coat. His breath was shallow, his fingers twitching. Maigret
crouched beside him, gripping his shoulder. "Who?" he demanded. "Who did this?"
Lemercier's lips moved, but the words barely escaped. "Garand, he—" Then just as suddenly as he had appeared, Antoine Lemercier went still. Duret cursed under his breath, his hands trembling. Maigret felt for a pulse, but he already
knew. Lemercier had taken his secrets to the grave. The street was empty now, save for the lingering scent of gunpowder and rain.
The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Someone had followed Lemercier. Someone who hadn't wanted him to talk. Maigret stood, his mind racing. Whoever had fired those shots was gone, but the message was clear. The stakes had just changed, and then he noticed something else. The cabinet. The door was slightly ajar, not wide open, not enough to be obvious, but just enough for someone in the room to have taken something. Maigret turned sharply to Duret, but the doctor only shook his head, his face ashen. "No," Duret stammered.
"I swear I didn't." Maigret pushed past him, yanking the cabinet door open, his gut twisted. The note? the one Le Mercier had sent, was gone. Someone had stolen it in the chaos. Maigret exhaled slowly. Whoever was working against him wasn't
just trying to kill witnesses. They were erasing the trail step by step, making sure the truth remained buried. The night had taken another piece of the puzzle, and Maigret wasn't sure how many more pieces he could afford to lose. The night had settled into an uneasy stillness, the rain having tapered off to a faint drizzle. The street outside remained empty, except for the lingering echoes of the gunshots that had taken Le Mercier's life. Maigret stood by the open cabinet, his fingers tightening around the edge of the wooden door. The stolen note gnawed at him. Someone had moved quickly, deliberately, using the chaos of Le Mercier's murder as cover. That meant whoever had taken it was already in the room before the first shot was fired. His eyes roamed the apartment, searching for something, anything that might tell him what Lemoyne had been trying to say. The space was neat, almost too neat, as if recently disturbed, and then carefully put back in order. Except for one thing, on the small wooden table beside Lemoyne's chair, a half-filled glass of water sat untouched, a slight film forming on its surface. Maigret frowned. Lemoyne had been waiting for someone? He had sat here, nervous, expectant, perhaps sipping the water to steady himself. The visitor had arrived. And then, minutes later, Lemoyne was dead. His gaze shifted. Next to the glass, a pack of cigarettes lay unopened. Lemoyne had been a heavy smoker. That much Maigret knew from the thick scent of tobacco that still clung to the air. Why an untouched pack? His fingers brushed the edge of the box. The answer struck him suddenly. Someone had brought it for him. Maigret's mind reeled back through his last encounters. Something about this felt familiar. A gesture, an object, and then, like a puzzle piece snapping into place, he saw it. Le Mercier had a pack of cigarettes beside him too, unopened. The memory hit like a bolt of lightning. At the time, he had dismissed it. A small detail, insignificant in the chaos of the murder, but now it was a thread connecting two deaths. Both men had been presented with an offering, something personal, something comforting, and then they had been killed. Maigret straightened, his heartbeat quickening. The pattern was there. The killer's method. A final moment of false peace before death. And if that was the case, then Maigret needed to act immediately. He left Lemoyne's apartment, stepping into the cool night air. The city felt different now, its shadows darker, its silence heavier. The murderer wasn't just covering tracks anymore, they were eliminating anyone who knew too much. And if the pattern held, there was only one man left on that list. Garand Whodunit,
man who had been at the center of this tangled web from the start. The man who had been silent for too long, lurking in the background while his old associates fell around him.
If the murderer had killed Le Mercier and Lemoyne to keep the past buried, then Garand's silence wouldn't last much longer. Maigret hailed a cab, giving the driver the address he had memorized. Garand had gone into hiding, but not well enough. The pieces were coming together too quickly now, and Maigret wasn't about to lose another witness. As the car sped through the rain-slicked streets, Maigret thought of something else, something that had gnawed at him since the beginning. The stolen note from Le Mercier's room, the one that had vanished just before the gunshot. Someone had known its importance before Maigret had even had a chance to read it, and that meant only one thing. The murderer wasn't working alone. A fresh wave of urgency gripped him. He had to reach Garand before the killer did, because if the pattern held, Garand was already living on borrowed time. The taxi screeched to a halt in front of a small, nondescript boarding house on the outskirts of town. Maigret stepped out, rain drizzling down onto his coat as he approached the entrance. He had expected some resistance. Garand had been running after all, but the door was slightly ajar, swinging lazily with the wind. A sense of dread settled in his chest. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick with the stale scent of dust and old cigarette smoke. The single lamp on the far side of the room cast flickering shadows on the walls. And there, slumped in an armchair, was Garand. His face was ashen, his eyes open but unseeing. A single bullet hole marked his temple. A gun rested in his limp hand, staged perfectly to resemble suicide. But Maigret had seen too many deaths staged this way. He knelt beside the body, scanning the scene with a trained eye. Garand had been silenced, just as Lemoine and Lemercier before him. But why now? The timing felt wrong. If Garand had truly known enough to get himself killed, why hadn't he spoken up sooner? Then Maigret noticed something. Garand's other hand was clenched tightly into a fist. He carefully pried the stiffening fingers apart and found a crumpled scrap of paper. Unlike the missing note from Lemercier's room, this one hadn't been taken. Whoever had killed Garand had either overlooked it or hadn't had time to search his body. The detective smoothed out the paper, his breath catching as he read the hurried, jagged scrawl. It was never about them. It was about her. Maigret's
mind raced. Her? Who was at the center of all this? The victims, Lemoine, Lemercier, Garand, had all been men. They had all been tied to old secrets, past crimes. But now, for the first time, a new thread emerged.
His thoughts reeled back to the people he had spoken to over the past days. A wife, a daughter, a lover left behind in the wake of whatever these men had done. He thought of Madame Lemercier, the widow who had seemed far too composed when speaking of her husband's murder, or perhaps Madame Garand, whom he had never met but whose absence had always felt conspicuous. Then he thought of the cigarettes, the unopened packs, a final, intimate gesture before death. And suddenly, it was so simple, so painfully obvious. This wasn't about power or money. It wasn't about covering tracks or eliminating rivals. This was personal. Someone had watched these men live their lives, carrying on as if they had done nothing wrong. Someone had waited, patient and deliberate, planning their revenge in a way they knew would go unnoticed at first. Maigret stood abruptly, the note still gripped in his fingers. He knew where he needed to go next. He had been chasing ghosts, looking for a man in the shadows. But the truth had been in front of him all along. The murderer wasn't hiding in the darkness. She was moving in plain sight. Maigret left Garand's boarding house without a word to the officers arriving on the scene. He gave them a look that told them to stay back. This wasn't their case anymore. This was his. The rain had picked up, falling in heavy sheets as he stepped back into the cab. He sat still for a moment, the city blurring past the wet windows, his thoughts locked onto the name that had settled heavily in his mind. Madame Lemercier. She had been there from the start, a grieving widow with dry eyes, her sorrow precise and controlled. Too composed for a woman who had just lost her husband. Maigret had seen genuine grief before, messy, unpredictable, full of contradictions. But hers had been measured, almost rehearsed, and then there were the cigarettes. A final, familiar comfort given to each victim before death. Someone had known them intimately, their habits, their routines. Not just an assassin eliminating loose ends, but someone who wanted them to see what was coming. He had suspected a partner before, someone working alongside the killer. But now he saw it clearly. There had never been two. There had only been
her. The taxi pulled up to the Le Mercier estate, its iron gate standing open. She was waiting.
Of course, she was waiting. Maigret stepped out, adjusting his coat against the wind, and made his way up the steps. He knocked once, firmly, and after a long pause, the door swung open. She stood there in a simple black dress, her expression unreadable. In her hands, she held a silver cigarette case. "Inspector Maigret," she said softly. "I was wondering when you'd come." He studied her, the way her fingers lingered over the case, tracing the edges absent-mindedly. She had been prepared for this
moment. "I saw Garin tonight," he said, stepping inside.
The warmth of the house closed around him, thick with the scent of something floral and faintly bitter. Her lips pressed together in something like a smile. "Then I suppose you found his note?" "I did." She moved toward a small table by the fireplace, opening the cigarette case and plucking one out. "He was the weakest of them?" she murmured, striking a match and lighting the cigarette with an elegant flick of her wrist. "I thought he might run to you." "You counted on it." She exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl upward. "It doesn't matter now, does it?" "It's over." Maigret studied her carefully. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even pretending to be. "You wanted them to suffer," he said after a moment. "You wanted them to understand before they died." Her eyes
flickered to his. A silent acknowledgement. "Who was she?" he asked.
For the first time, a crack, the tiniest fracture in her composure. She took another slow drag, but her fingers trembled slightly. "My sister," she said finally. "They ruined her, used her, tossed her aside when they were done. She was nothing to them." Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it now, something raw. "I was just a girl then. I couldn't save her." Maigret nodded. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it aloud changed everything. "You waited years," he said. "You watched them live their lives, grow comfortable, complacent. And when they least expected it, you came back. I gave them the same kindness they gave her," she said. A moment of false comfort before the end. She turned slightly, as if weighing her next move. He knew what was coming. He had seen it in the eyes of many before her, the realization that there were no more steps left to take, that the game was over. But then she did something unexpected. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small vial. Maigret didn't move. "You won't stop me," she said quietly. "This is my choice." He could have lunged for it, could have knocked it from her hand, but instead he took a step closer, his voice calm. "You've already won, Madame Le Mercier," he said. "They're dead. You got your revenge. But if you take that now, you let them take something else from you. Your ending." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. A single moment of hesitation. Maigret held out his hand. "Come with me." She looked at him, searching for something in his expression. And then, slowly, she placed the vial in his palm. The tension eased, the moment passing like a final breath. She straightened, lifting her chin. "I suppose I always knew it would end like this," Maigret nodded. "So did I. The sound of distant sirens grew louder as he led her toward the door. As Maigret guided Madame Lemercier through the front doors of her estate, the sirens drew closer, their wailing a grim herald of finality. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, mist curling through the wrought-iron gates, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The moment should have felt like closure, the final piece of a puzzle settling into place. But as Maigret glanced at the woman beside him, something unsettled him. She wasn't broken. There was no resignation in her posture, no true surrender in her steps. A woman who had spent years meticulously planning vengeance did not simply hand herself over without a fight, and then there was the vial. It had been too easy. She had relinquished it too willingly, as though it had never truly mattered. Maigret tightened his grip on her arm, his instincts bristling with unease. The police cars rolled to a stop, and from the lead vehicle, Inspector Lucas emerged, his expression a mixture of relief and curiosity. "So it was her," he murmured, taking in the composed figure of Madame Lemercier. "I can't say I'm surprised, but—" A single gunshot cracked through the night. The officers ducked, hands flying. To their weapons, Maigret turned sharply, his gaze darting toward the shadowed hedges along the drive. In that fleeting instant, he saw the glint of metal, the faint outline of a figure vanishing into the darkness. Lemercier didn't flinch. The shot hadn't been
meant for her. Maigret spun back to Lucas, who stood rigid, a look of stunned confusion on his face. Then slowly he staggered backward.
Blood blossomed through his coat, dark and spreading. "Lucas!" Maigret lunged, catching him before he collapsed to the ground. Chaos erupted. Officers fanned out, shouting orders, weapons raised. But Maigret wasn't listening. His focus was on Lucas, whose breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. The bullet had caught him in the side, missing anything immediately fatal. But it had been close. This wasn't an execution. It was a warning. Someone had just told Maigret in no uncertain terms that they were not finished. He looked up sharply at Madame Lemercier. She met his gaze with that same unreadable expression, her dark eyes unwavering. "This wasn't you," he murmured. It wasn't a question. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. "No, Inspector, it wasn't." And suddenly, the entire case tilted on its axis. The revenge, the cigarettes, the carefully staged deaths. Lemercier had played her part, yes, but she was not alone. There was another hand in this, one that had remained hidden in the shadows, using her as a distraction, a second player, and now they were tying up loose ends. Lucas let out a pained breath, gripping Maigret's sleeve. "Go!" he rasped. Maigret hesitated only for a second before rising. "Find him!" he barked at the officers.
"Lock down the estate. No one leaves."
He turned back to Lemercier. "Who else knew?" Her gaze flickered just briefly toward the house. It was enough. Maigret strode past her, his mind racing. If someone else had been orchestrating this from the beginning, they wouldn't be running. Now, not yet. They would still be watching, making sure their plan played out exactly as intended. He reached the grand staircase inside, his eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor above. A creak. Someone was there. Without hesitation, he took the steps two at a time. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. The study. Maigret pushed it open. A man stood by the fireplace, his back to the room, calmly exhaling a plume of smoke. "Inspector?" the man said without turning. "You're quicker than I expected." Recognition settled in Maigret's chest like a lead weight. Etienne Vallon, Lemercier's late husband's lawyer. the very man who had handled the business dealings of every victim. A quiet, unremarkable figure who had slipped through the investigation without so much as a second glance. Until now, Maigrè's voice was steady. "You were always part of it, weren't you?" Vallon turned at last, his expression one of detached amusement. "Not always, but long enough." "You gave Lemercier the names, the details. You guided her every step of the way." Vallon shrugged. "She had the passion. I had the patience." His lips curled slightly. "And now she takes the fall. Neatly wrapped,
Beautifully executed. No one ever suspects the man in the background. But Maigret was already shaking his head. "You miscalculated."
Vallon raised a brow. Maigret took a slow step forward. "You should have killed her first." For the first time, Vallon's smirk faltered. "You wanted her to play the vengeful widow, to be so consumed by grief that no one would ever see the hand."
"Guiding her," Maigret continued, "but you underestimated her."
A flicker of doubt passed through Vallon's sharp eyes. His fingers tightened around the cigarette. Then another creak. Maigret didn't look away, but he knew. Someone else was standing in the doorway, Madame Lemercier. Her voice was quiet, but razor-sharp. "You always were very good at hiding, Etienne." Vallon went still. "You should have run," she continued, stepping fully into the room. "But you just couldn't help yourself, could you?" Maigret watched the shift in Vallon's stance, the slight tilt of his weight, the way his fingers drifted toward his pocket. A weapon. Maigret reacted first. In a single movement, he grabbed the heavy glass ashtray from the desk and sent it crashing into Vallon's wrist. The man cried out, the small pistol clattering to the floor. Before he could recover, Maigret seized him by the collar and drove him back against the wall. Vallon struggled, but it was useless. The fight had left him the moment his mask had slipped. Madame Lemercier approached slowly, her gaze cold. Maigret held Vallon firm. "It's over," the lawyer let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. "You really think so?" Outside, the sirens
howled. The city stirred. But inside that room, in that final moment, Maigret knew, this time, there were no more loose ends. Maigret tightened his grip on Vallon's collar, feeling the man's breath quicken. The struggle had drained out of him, yet something in his eyes remained unnerving, something that told Maigret this wasn't quite over. He knew the look well. It was the expression of a man who still believed against all odds that he could find a way out. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. The officers were closing in. Madame Lemercier stepped forward, her face a careful mask, though Maigret could see the fury simmering beneath the surface. She had spent years believing she was the architect of her vengeance, only to discover she had been little more than a pawn in someone else's game. Vallon let out a breathless laugh. "Tell me, Lemercier, did you really think you were the only one who wanted them dead?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth hung between them like a blade, sharp, undeniable. Maigret didn't ease his hold. "You had access to all of them," he said, his voice steady. "The investors, the old business partners. You knew who was vulnerable, who had wronged whom. You let her do the killing, but it was always your hand guiding the knife." Vallon smirked, though his confidence had begun to fray at the edges. "And yet here you are, holding me for what? Whispering in a widow's ear? I never pulled the trigger. I never poured the poison. It was her." Lemercier's expression didn't change. "And who," she asked quietly, "sent the man to Shoot your inspector outside. For the first time, Vallon hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, Maigret caught it. You have an accomplice. Vallon's smirk twitched, then vanished altogether. The officers arrived at the study door.
Weapons drawn.
Inspector? Maigret exhaled, knowing there was only one answer. Take him! The room filled with movement as Vallon was wrenched from Maigret's grasp, his arms forced behind his back. He didn't resist, but as they led him away, he
Cast a final glance over his shoulder, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. I wonder, he mused, if you'll ever really know how deep this goes. And then he was gone, swallowed into the waiting night. Silence settled over the room. Le Mercier remained still, staring after him, her fingers curling and uncurling at her sides. Maigret turned to her. Are you satisfied? She gave a quiet, bitter laugh. I don't know. It was an honest answer. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the night still carried a sense of weight, something unfinished. Vallon was in custody, but he had left behind an uneasy question. Someone else had fired that shot at Lucas. Someone else had been working alongside him. Maigret stepped onto the gravel drive, watching as Vallon was loaded into the waiting car. Their eyes met once more through the glass. Vallon was still smirking. And suddenly Maigret knew. The accomplice wasn't some hired gun, some distant figure pulling strings from afar. It was someone close, someone already in plain sight. His mind reeled back through the case, through every name, every alibi, every careful misdirection. He had seen it. He had already seen it, he just hadn't understood. The car pulled away, disappearing into the Parisian streets. Maigret stood motionless, the realization settling over him like a shadow. Justice had been served, or had it just slipped? Through his fingers once again. Maigret stood beneath the dim street lamp, the city wrapped in a hush of late-night silence. A cigarette smouldered between his fingers, the glow pulsing like a slow heartbeat as he stared into the darkness where Vallon's car had disappeared. The case was over. Officially. The papers would report his triumph, the commissioner would be pleased, and the townspeople would rest easier knowing the killer had been caught. And yet something gnawed at him, a single loose thread too fine to be noticed by most, but to Maigret it was like a stone in his shoe, small yet impossible to ignore. Lucas stepped beside him, hands shoved into his coat pockets. The bruises on his face had darkened, souvenirs from the attempt on his life. He had barely escaped, and that fact alone unsettled Maigret. If Vallon had truly been the mastermind, why had the shooter failed? Vallon was too meticulous for such a careless misstep, unless, of course, that wasn't part of his plan at all. You're thinking something, Lucas murmured. Maigret exhaled a stream of smoke, watching it twist in the cold air. I'm thinking about coincidences, Lucas huffed. You don't believe in those? Exactly. The night felt stretched thin, as if behind its quiet facade something still lurked, something waiting to be noticed. Maigret replayed the case in his mind, sifting through every conversation, every clue. There was something he had missed. Then, like a whisper at the edge of his thoughts, it came to him. The first note. The warning before the murders had even begun. Someone had sent an anonymous message hinting at what was to come. The note had led him to Le Mercier, to Vallon, to everything that had followed. But no one had ever claimed responsibility for it. If Vallon had truly orchestrated everything, why would he tip his hand before he had even begun? It made no sense. unless someone else had been pulling the strings from the shadows, nudging Maigret toward a truth they wanted him to see, while keeping another buried. His pulse quickened. He had been played. Not by Vallon, but by someone even more careful. Someone who had been guiding this game from the very beginning. Lucas shifted beside him. "You want me to call for them to bring Vallon back?" Maigret shook his head. "No, Vallon was always just a piece of it. There's someone else." "Who?" The answer was there, just beyond his reach, taunting him. He had the puzzle, almost, complete, yet the last piece refused to fit. He turned, staring up at the building across the street, its windows dark and lifeless. Somewhere in that city, someone was watching, someone who had counted on him stopping here, satisfied with the solution he had been handed. He dropped the cigarette, crushing it beneath his heel. "Come on, Lucas." "Where?" Maigret's eyes gleamed with something between determination and exhaustion. "To find out who's been whispering in the dark." The night swallowed them as they walked away, and though the case was closed, the mystery was far from over.